What are lance pennons, and why did the British Army use ones which were red and white? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms, and I should briefly mention before I go on that this video is kindly sponsored by History Hit, but more about that in a minute. So recently I've done a number of videos talking about lances, and in fact over the years I've done tons of videos talking about lances from horseback. And recently I had my great guest and friend Zach Evans on, and he is a lancer, if we can call him that. He's a jouster amongst other things. And also of course we should bear in mind that lancers are still an element of many modern militaries, so people are still training with lances, still using lances on parade, and of course most military lancers these days use armoured fighting vehicles of various different sorts, but nevertheless they still parade with lances, they still train with lances, and there are still people around the world doing what's known as skill at arms, that is, practicing, training, and indeed even competing in the use of the lance. Different things like tent pegging and scoring for the ring, and indeed jousting as well within a medieval reenactment context. So there are lots of people in the world still using lances, even today, even to a top competitive level. So the two main questions we're going to look at in this video is, number one, what are lance pennons or flags, and why did they come about, and what were they used for, and who used them? Kind of roll that into one question. And secondly, why did and still does the British Army predominantly, if not totally, predominantly use pennons on their lances which are red and white, red above, white below. But before we delve into that, a very quick word about the amazing sponsors for this video, the very apt History Hit. History Hit brings you the stories that shaped history. It's for history lovers. It's like Netflix, but it's all history. And if you want to check it out, I've got an amazing offer for you today. You can stream and download hundreds of hours of history documentaries and podcasts onto any device, and you can watch it anytime, anywhere. You can watch on your phone, on your tablet, on your television, on your desktop. And as well as already having hundreds of hours of programs on there to watch right now, they add 2 more every week from experts such as Dan Snow, Dan Jones, and Professor Susanna Lipscomb. And very appropriately right now, I'm enjoying Waterloo's Warriors series on History Hit, which is obviously very relevant to this video and covers various actions that happened at the Battle of Waterloo, including actions of the French and Polish lancers. It delves into period primary sources, which, as you know, I absolutely love, and has a number of very reputable experts on the series. And some of you may have noticed that Ridley Scott is releasing a certain movie about a certain French or Corsican general this month, and therefore there is a lot of Napoleon-related content on History Hit at the moment as well. So whether it's Tudors you're after or whether it's Napoleonics, you can find it on History Hit. So here's the special offer that History Hit have offered me and you, my viewers, and that is for it to be only £1 a month for the first 3 months. That's all. This would also make a great gift given that we're coming up to Christmas as well. So £1 a month for the first 3 months, and the discount code is Schola Gladiatoria 1. That's Schola Gladiatoria 1. That's case sensitive, so it has to be in uppercase, and so make sure you select the monthly subscription. And you can find the link to the sign up page down below in the description box under this video. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the main content of this video. So first up, what are lance pennons? Quite simply, they're a flag hanging from the end of a lance, attached to the end of the lance. Now they can actually take various different shapes. They could usually rectangular, triangular, or what we call swallowtail. That's like 2 little triangles at the end. And they're attached in a number of different ways, usually, certainly in the later period which we're going to focus on in this video, that is the 18th and 19th centuries, they are sort of tied on or laced on. So they can be removed, they can be rolled up, they can be slid up and down the shaft. Now interestingly, if you try and find out why these originally came about, why did lances have these little flags attached to the end of them, you'll actually find various different answers given by different sources, not just modern sources, modern historians or websites or whatever, but also period sources as well. And it seems to a degree it's probably either a number of different factors, or in fact it's lost to the mist of time and no one exactly knows why, if there was one reason. But here are the reasons which are usually given. So one of them is for designation or signalling essentially to show what unit you are. So just the same as heraldry or crests on helmets or this type of thing, or indeed different coloured uniforms, simply to show which unit that was. That's one idea. Another idea is this is a curious one actually, and I didn't discover this until recently. One idea is it's actually partly for safety, and that is because with a long lance waving it around, it'd be quite easy for a body of soldiers with long pole arms to accidentally get one in the eye or or poke a horse or this kind of thing, and so they're there to kind of signify where the end of the lance is. I've got to be honest, I'm not fully convinced by this point at all, because we don't really see that being a thing with other types of pole arms, such as pikes, so I'm not very convinced by that one. Now, the next theory kind of sounds even more wacky, but might have some degree of truth to that, and that is when you have a lance by itself, it's a pretty aerodynamic object, but when you attach a pennon or a flag to the pointy end, it creates drag and actually gives you a feeling of where the tip is and helps you control it. Is this true? Is it not? I don't know. I'm not a horse person. I'm not a jouster. Most jousters don't have any form of flag or anything on the point of their lance. And you kind of think that they're being like super accurate. And usually when people do skillet arms, tent pegging or skewering the hoop, they don't have any pennon or anything on the end. So I think that this is probably rubbish, unfortunately. I like the idea of it, but I don't think it really stands up. But maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe you know some more evidence for this. Get posting below if you know of any evidence, or indeed if you have found that by using a lance on horseback to be the case. But here's my favourite reason, and this is actually absolutely mentioned in 19th century cavalry treatises, and that is having a little brightly coloured flag on the end of your lance. You can actually wave it in front of an opponent's horse and discombobulate it. So in other words, just confuse the horse and use it almost as an offensive thing. Now, this seems wacky, but actually makes a lot of sense when you're around horses. And most horses, I mean, I'm not really a horse person, but I know lots of people who are. If you suddenly flap a handkerchief in their face, they're not going to like it in general, especially if they're not used to it. And even if they're to some degree trained to be used to it, it could be useful. And this, as I say, is absolutely categorically mentioned in 19th century sources as a use for the lance pennon, and lancers trained to do this. So they did train to lower their flag in front of the opponent's horse's face and flap it a bit before sort of jabbing in, lunging in essentially with their horse. And bear in mind also that lances weren't only used on the move, so you weren't only kind of riding at high speed and skewering things like you might imagine in jousting or tent pegging, but very often the horse might have come to a standstill, or might only be, you know, wheeling around, turning, or might only be at a trot, and you still got to use the lance. So there are many different ways that the lance was used, not only couched under the arm, sometimes held at arm's length, sometimes thrust from above. Even there were stabs from behind and over the arm as well. So the lance was used in very diverse ways, and not only with the pointy end, because we also have a shoe, or essentially a ferrule at the bottom end, and that bottom end was sometimes used offensively as well, and in fact defensively also. So the entire weapon was used, the whole thing was turned around. It has a lot more diverse uses than I think most people, and certainly if you look at Hollywood movies, most people would think of a lance as being used as. And so this flag, this pennon, is kind of part of that broader system. I'd also mention, just very briefly before I go in, you'll notice that I changed between the words pennon and flag when talking about these things, and that is because the period sources do as well. And in fact, if we look at British Army regulations, they actually refer to it as the flag. So some of you who are going, you must call it a pennon, it's the proper name is the pennon. Well, actually, my main source is British Army 19th century, and they call it a flag. So I'll call it a flag sometimes. So very briefly, who used flags on lances? Well, they were used quite a lot in the medieval period. They weren't in any way universal, but they seem to have become very common, or more common, as we get into the 17th century. And certainly by the 18th century and 19th centuries, they were practically normal. However, an interesting detail, they weren't always kept on in war. So sometimes certainly by the 19th century, and certainly by World War I, this was definitely the case, we see that flags or pennons were attached to the end of lances in most sort of patrolling and parade and that kind of stuff, and they were often removed. You could quite easily remove them because they were just held on by about 4 eyelets with some cord around, or thong. So you just undo them and take them off. Now, as far as I can tell so far, and again, feel free to post below and expand on this or correct me if you think I'm wrong, but the impression I get is that they were normal on lances, let's say in the Napoleonic period, and indeed in the Crimean War, but in the second half of the 19th century, with increasing danger of being shot by rifles at long range and being spotted, they started to remove them. So by World War I, they were definitely not normal on lances in war, but in the Crimean War, it seems they were absolutely still normally being worn in lances. So in this same period in which the rifle, and particularly the breech-loading rifle and ultimately the bolt-action rifle came in, it seems that lance pennons or flags started to be taken off in action. Kind of the similar period to when people started putting more camouflaged colours on instead of brightly coloured uniforms. So why does the British Army, and did the British Army, use a red and white pennon? Now, this actually came up as a direct question under one of my recent videos and made me think, do you know, I've never addressed that in any video ever. And I thought I knew the answer. Turns out I did, but I had to go and fact check it and make sure that what I knew was correct and not just received wisdom. Never rely on received wisdom. Always go and fact check yourself before you go and make a video about it. That's my advice to you if you're a budding YouTuber, because it can come around to bite you in the butt later if you just repeat something that someone told you without checking it. But it turns out I was correct. Now, in a nutshell, it's because of the Polish. Now, I'll come back to that because it's a little bit more convoluted and complicated than that. But the red and white is essentially because of Poland. So you think, well, what's that got to do with British Lancers? Well, here's the thing. First of all, a tiny bit of context. Pennons or flags on lances could come in numerous different colours. And clearly, if we go back to the medieval, late medieval and Renaissance periods, we find often the colours relate to heraldic motifs. Sometimes they relate to saints, sometimes they relate to national or regional, like a certain county or something like that. So they can have all sorts of meanings to them, and even to some degree regimental as well. So if we come forward to let's say the year 1900, if you look at the kind of German armies, then you'll find that the colours of the lances used by the Uhlans are essentially based on which of the German states they're from. So we do find that, you get a whole bunch of different colours. However, in the British Army, it's a little bit different. In the British Army, we only get Lancers from 1816 onwards, and I'll come back to that point in a second. But from 1816 onwards, we find that Lancers, about 95% of British Lancers, have pennons, or flags as I should call them, which are red above white. Okay, and they are swallow-tailed as well, so they're one specific design. Now, I say 95%, actually there are some units that were formerly, and are kind of still in the British Army, but come from the East India Company. Okay, so the confusing factor here is the fact that we've got the British Army and we have the Indian Army. Now, I think a lot of people think of those as the same thing, but administratively, you've got to bear in mind that up until 1857, we had the Queen's Army under Victoria, anyway, the King's Army under George. We had the Queen's Army was the British Army, and then you had the East India Company, which was a semi-independent, although strongly attached to the British Crown, trading company that had its own army and navy. Okay, so there was an East India Company Army, East India Company Navy. In 1857, a little old thing that we often refer to as the Indian Mutiny, or the First War of Independence if you're in India, or the Sepoy Revolt, or various other names that it goes by, the Great Rebellion. In 1857 and 1858, that happened. And after that, the British government decided to dissolve the East India Company and absorb it into central British government. And all of the East India Company troops became British Army troops. But administratively, they were still kept under the headings of Indian Army and British Army. Why am I telling you all this? Quite simply because some of the cavalry regiments in the Indian Army didn't conform to standard British Army uniforms, doctrine, even things like saddles and stuff. They were more independent. So, for example, Skinner's horse didn't use these red and white pennons. They had, I think, yellow ones to match their uniform. So you do find other units in the British Army, actually Indian Army, that don't conform to the red and white. But if you look at, for example, the modern regiment of the Royal Lancers, they do have the red and white pennons, and red and white pennons were absolutely normal across most of the Lancers in the British Empire. So why is this the case? Why the red and white flag on the end of a lance? Well, quite simply, it goes back to Napoleon. So you may or may not know that Napoleon essentially got his lancers from Poland, okay? And he created a body of troops made up of Polish lancers initially, but then he formed his own body of French lancers, but modelled elements of their uniform on the Polish lancers. This all stemmed from when Napoleon entered Warsaw in 1806, 10 years before the British had even adopted lancers. So in 1806, Napoleon's armies arrived in Warsaw, and he was incredibly impressed by the Polish cavalry guard using lances and decided to essentially emulate them. So the very year after, in 1807, he formed a Polish guard of lancers in the Imperial Guard. And in 1809, in true Republican Napoleonic sense, Napoleon declared himself as the Grand Duke of Warsaw. So he was really taking in all of this Polish culture, and he equipped his lancers with lances, because they were lancers, with pennons on them which were red above white. And as I say, he created whole new uniforms for them, and in fact within the Imperial Guard, the Polish lancers wore the chapka, which is a type of lancer's cap, essentially, as it was known throughout Europe, and in fact it was copied in Britain. The German states copied it, all, even in South America, copied all over the place. And these essentially have a square board on the top. And this is a Polish style of lancer's cap, the chapka, which the French copied. The only major change they made to it was adding a French cockade onto it. So they kind of adapted it a bit. But essentially what Napoleon did was he created this body of Polish lancers within the Imperial Guards, right at the centre of his army. He gave them lances with their red and white pennons, and he gave them very distinctive uniforms. Now, essentially what happened was the Battle of Waterloo, in which the lancers actually performed pretty well. And in fact, the Polish lancers had performed very well against the British throughout the Peninsular War. And then in 1815, with the Allied army coming in, they were a major concern. I mean, the French cavalry were very formidable. The cuirassiers, all the light cavalry, the heavy cavalry, and the lancers as well, all performed very well in Napoleon's army in general, and were much admired around Europe. So contrary to maybe modern perception of patriotism, in 1816, this is after the war's ended, okay? So Waterloo was 1815, Napoleon's now out of the picture, 1816, there's been a restoration of the monarchy in France, and the British army and the rest of the Allies are essentially occupying France at this point, so they're kind of making sure that peace remains. This has been a major war. Europe's never seen a war like this before. And the British start to enter into a period of massive military overhaul. It's now entering into a post-war period, an occupation period, but also they're looking at the French and going, okay, what have they got that's really good that we can copy? And they decided to copy the Polish lancers. You could say copy the French lancers, but it's the French-Polish lancers. So essentially they copied the uniforms, they copied the lances, they created the lancers, and they copied the pennons of red over white. And it's really as simple as that. The British simply copied the French, who had sort of copied the Polish, but sort of when they were absorbing the Polish and creating their own kind of version of this Polish-Franco melding. So ultimately, the basic answer for why the British Army had and still has red above white pennons on their lances is because of the Polish Lancers under Napoleon. And this is still being used today in the British Army for parade purposes. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting and illuminating. There's a lot more that we can say about Lancers, even examples, primary sources I've got of interesting actions. And also there's a lot more we can talk about the lances themselves, not just the flag at the end, but the actual construction and different types of lances. Anyway, if it's been interesting, if you want to hear more about lances, then get posting down below. And thanks once again to the sponsors for this video and this channel. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I have been Matt Easton and I will continue to be. I hope I'll see you back here again soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.